Good afternoon, and welcome back to the Penn Social Science and Policy Forum. For those of you who are our regulars who came frequently last year, for those of you who are coming to the Social Science and Policy Forum's workshops for the first time, also welcome. The Social Science and Policy Forum is a university-wide initiative to bring together policy-relevant scholarship and policymakers around major problems of our time. Last year's theme was the global economic crisis, and for those of you who were not able to attend our really stimulating series of lectures and workshops and other programs last year, you can find most of them available on the Penn Social Science and Policy Forum YouTube page. In fact, you'll see that we're recording this for posterity as well. This year's theme is immigration, and we have an extraordinary roster of folks from the policy and academic worlds coming to address us over the course of the year. We kicked off last night with a very well-attended public event at the National Museum of American Jewish History on who should be an American, discussing the past and future of immigration policy in the United States. Our speakers included Tamar Jacoby, who is the CEO of Immigration Works, a policy reform organization in Washington, Joseph Berger from the New York Times, and Mae Ngai, who will be speaking this afternoon. Coming up on the docket, and you can find more on our webpage or friend us on Facebook, we have, among others, Michael Jones Correa, the political scientist at Cornell. We have Maria Cristina Garcia, also from Cornell, who works on refugee policy. We have Marcelo Suarez Orozco, who is the Dean of the Graduate School of Education at UCLA. We have Demetrius Papadimitriou, who's the head of the Migration Studies Institute. Migration Policy Institute. So we have quite an extraordinary roster, and many, many more coming over the course of the next couple of semesters, tapping with an end-of-the-year conference program, TBA, on immigrants and urban revitalization that will be held in early May. So I am delighted to introduce our first workshop presenter. She is Mae Ngai, who is the professor of history and Lung Family Professor of Asian American Studies at Columbia University, her alma mater, where she earned her PhD. Mae has also been on the faculty at the University of Chicago. Many of you, including my graduate students, will know her extraordinary book, Impossible Subjects, which is one of those rare books that completely transforms the way we think about a field. It exemplifies some of Mae's real talents as a scholar. It's really virtuosic command of a wide variety of different sources, ranging from statistics, data from the federal government, records from the federal agencies responsible for dealing with immigration and deportation, individuals' diaries, interviews, all sorts of public records, labor records, newspapers. It's really an amazing piece of scholarship, and one that has really transformed the way that we think about the history of immigration and immigration policy over the 20th century, one that really powerfully draws from many different currents of historiography, synthesizing political history, the history of social sciences, transnational and borderlands history, social history, cultural history. It's really an amazing work. She's authored more recently of The Lucky Ones, which is a biography of a Chinese-American family over a pretty long period of time, and one that really shows off a very different set of scholarly skills than that which she deployed in her first book, also drawing, though, from many of the same extraordinary records that she uses in that. And she's currently involved in another project, taking her to another century and taking her well outside of the United States, to the other side of the world, indeed, and that's what she's going to be talking about this afternoon, Yellow and Gold, the Chinese question on the California and Victoria, Australia goldfields. So with no further ado, I'll turn the floor over to Mae. Welcome, Mae.
Thank you so much, Tom, for that very kind introduction. And thanks to all of you for coming today. It's great to see all of you here. It's a beautiful day. I'm sure some of you would be rather outside, but I appreciate your attendance. It's great to be back here at Penn. You know, it was a really nice program last night, and it's really wonderful for me to get to visit my friends and colleagues here. Okay, so my talk today draws from my research on Chinese gold mining and the anti-Chinese politics in the Pacific world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In this research, I'm interested in two different but related trans-Pacific circuits. Right? One is the circuit of the Chinese who went to the gold fields in California and the British colonies of Victoria and the Transvaal in South Africa, and the patterns of labor, ownership, and social organization that they brought with them and adapted to local conditions. The second circuit I'm interested in is that of the circulation of racial politics, the so-called Chinese question that took hold in gold rush settler societies, and how these contributed to the development of a global anti-Chinese discourse and policy. So although I work on three regions today, I'm going to focus on California and Victoria. I tried to get this talk last week with all three, and it went on way too long. So if you have questions about South Africa, I can try to share them. During the second half of the 19th century, the largest gold deposits yet known in the world were discovered. From 1848 to 1891, a series of gold rushes swept California and the American West, Australasia, South Africa, and Western Canada, drawing hundreds of thousands of gold seekers from around the world. In fewer than 50 years, miners and mining companies extracted from the earth some 435 million ounces of gold, which is more than the total that had been produced in the previous 3,000 years. This sudden increase in world gold production was itself the product of Anglo-American settler colonialism and capitalist development. Of course, gold has always been prized for its beauty and durability since ancient times. Indigenous populations on the 19th century colonial frontiers were long aware of alluvial gold deposits in their midst, but they did not value gold as the money commodity. The gold rushes not only furthered the dispossession of native peoples, sustained exploitation of gold required capital investment, deep mining technologies, mass labor migrations, and long-distance transportation. Gold transformed the Pacific world of its discovery and the global economy generally. It was a stimulus that accelerated both the economic development of local gold mining regions and the international financial power of Great Britain and the United States as creditor and investor nations. So you can see here the red X's of where these biggest contracts were, or most of the gold strength in this time period. Now the prospect of gold attracted men, for they were nearly all men, from the British Isles and continental Europe, the Americas, and the Asia Pacific. The rushes were by their nature short-term, quick bonanzas or failures for the individual miners engaged in alluvial mining. Alluvial meaning surface or placer mining. These deposits sooner or later became depleted and gave way to underground rock, hard rock, or quartz mining. And this is when gold mining quickly becomes a business with stockholders, managers, engineers, and wage labor. So for many independent gold seekers, the rush was a short-term experience. Not a few were serial rushers, described by one historian as, quote, a variety of the genus Pacific man whose habitat is no particular country but the gold fields, unquote. Others went home after the rush, with or without gold, and still others, as well as the merchants, artisans, and shopkeepers who followed in their wake, settled and became known in their respective national histories as pioneer citizens, lauded for their driving democratic and entrepreneurial spirit. Chinese made up upwards of 25% of mining populations in California and Victoria in the 1850s and 60s, but they remain marginal figures in most historical accounts of the gold rushes and gold mining. When they do appear, they are noted as objects of Euro-American racism and xenophobia, not as historical subjects in their own right. Recent interest in the politics surrounding the Chinese question or the coolie question has focused mostly on discourse and policy with little empirical investigation into the condition and experience of Chinese labor, especially during the early mining years. So we know a lot more about what white people thought about Chinese labor than we know about Chinese labor itself. But our understanding of the gold rushes is not only incomplete, The disparity in scholarship has also clouded thinking about the politics of inclusion and exclusion that characterized this era in the United States and Australia. Most notably, in mainstream U.S. historical literature, scholars remain committed to the view that Chinese labor in the American West was unfree. Now, this was not the view of scholars in the early and mid-20th century. It was introduced in 1964 by Gunther Barth in his book, Bitter Strength. Barth argued that the credit ticket system by which many Chinese migrants financed their passage to America was a system of debt bondage organized and enforced by Chinese Native Place Organization, or the Pueblo. Barth received his PhD from Harvard, where he was a student of Oscar Hamlin. His theory of Chinese sojourning and unfreedom intended to prove by way of exception Hamlin's normative theory of American immigration as one of settlement and assimilation. Barth's argument rested on a questionable use of sources. He selectively quoted from newspaper commentary and testimonies from certain witnesses before state and congressional hearings on the Chinese problem, while ignoring or dismissing conflicting arguments and testimonies. Now, among Asian Americanist scholars, there is a consensus that Chinese immigration to the United States was voluntary. But U.S. economic and labor scholars since the 1970s have cited Barth in the same questionable sources, entrenching this view in literature. And if you go to some of this work, and these are by prominent historians whom I respect a lot, and you look at their footnotes, it's all the same footnotes piled up, repeated one after the other. And, you know, I must say, these testimonies are 1,500 pages of stuff, and it's like, did anybody read all of this? I mean, if anything, if you read it, you would see that there are widely differing opinions by people. So it actually needs a lot of interrogation to figure out at least what the testimony said. But in any sense, in my view, the historiography remains hobbled by what I call an Orientalist blind spot. And what I mean by that is that enduring stereotypes of Chinese as both slavish and despotic lend credence to depictions of Chinese as indentured, bound by debt peonage, or otherwise enslaved by custom, even when the evidence is problematic or thin. The Australian historiography is not similarly burdened by this bias, although it too suffers from a disjuncture between particularist focus on Chinese Australian studies and discursive analysis of white Australia politics. So I'm offering, I hope, a fresh examination of the Chinese question by making two interventions. The first, my studies comparative and transnational, a method that I believe enables us to see beyond that which in a single nation state context might seem normative. And California and Victoria are well suited for comparison. They were two of the three largest gold strikes in the 19th century, taking off just a few years apart. Both attracted miners from around the world, including China, and both passed restrictive immigration laws against Chinese. There are also important differences. For example, I think probably most importantly, Victoria was a formal colony in the British Empire, and the United States, while often behaving in many ways like an empire, is a sovereign republic. In general, I'm situating my work as part of a scholarship on comparative settler colonialism, in which Australian and New Zealand historians are particularly prominent. I think people like Patrick Rolfe, Marilyn Lake, James Bellish, Lisa Ford, and Miranda Johnson. These latter two are young scholars actually trained in the United States from Australia and come back here to teach. In the United States, the scholarship is less developed, perhaps because exceptionalism has obscured America's own settler colonial characteristics. But you can see in American studies whether Penn's David Zangen works on this question, Mark Lifkin is another. My second intervention is that I argue that the Chinese question must be tackled empirically, not just discursively. So I've researched government records, company records, other contemporary accounts to flesh out the nature of Chinese mining organization. The data are scattered and incomplete, especially in California, but one can learn still a great deal about the varieties of mine labor from what is available. And newspaper articles, legislative records, and other contemporary writings by both Euro-Americans and Chinese bear out the trajectories of racial politics. So out of a rich mix of local experience and transnational dynamics, I've tried to identify patterns of similarity and difference and the contingencies that produce them. And these contingencies, in my view, are at the heart of my analysis, and I think at the heart of historical analysis, more than anything else, for that is what explains historical variation and change. And it's my hope that such analysis might yet rescue Chinese labor from early crisis layoff. Okay, so let me give you a sketch first of Chinese labor, Chinese mining labor, and ownership and social organization. I'm going to not dwell on a lot of the specifics or empirical work because it's actually a lot. And so if you have questions about the sources, I'd be happy to answer them later. But I'm just going to kind of go through the range here and the trajectory. So the first miners, ironically enough, were contracted workers. They appear to be a group of about 60 Chinese that came to mine in Mae County. They were contracted by investors in Shanghai, actually British investors, with passage money that was to be deducted from their wages, and they were supervised on-site by Mexican miners from Sonora. This is a Chinese camp, a different one in Yuba County, from John Borthwick's book, who wrote a very interesting travel account through the mines, and this is very early, also 1850 about, and the way he describes the camp, it has all the appearances of a large operation of contracted workers, 150 people, many tents, large pieces of equipment, supervisors, this kind of thing. In the first month and year of the gold rush, Mae County was awash with miners from around the world. Not just the Chinese, but other prospectors also used workers under contract, including Californians, Sonorans, and Chileans. Some white to the American South brought enslaved Africans to the gold fields, and others hired or impressed Miwok Indians and Native Hawaiians for placer mining. Now, ethnic relations on the gold fields were not always conflictual. Europeans and Americans, for example, learned gold washing techniques from Mexicans and Chileans. But in the fevered atmosphere of the rush, nativism proved a useful weapon of competition. White Americans used violence or the threat of violence to drive foreigners from profitable claims, French, Australians, and especially Mexicans and Chileans, who actually were experienced miners and therefore opposed in this competition. So as part of this general pattern, whites drove the Chinese company from their diggings at Salvador. The Americans did not justify their action against the Chinese on grounds that they were contracted workers or indentured workers. In general, nativism did not focus on the question of free or unfree labor, perhaps because so many Americans themselves were engaged in the practice. White Americans simply claimed an entitlement, a national entitlement to non-English riches. Now, this use of contracted labor, not only among Chinese, but among others as well, was short-lived. Violent expulsions from successful claims meant losses for investors. And there's also quite a bit of evidence that contracts were not enforceable. People just walked away, right, and went digging on their own. So importing Chinese contract labor, like for other groups, for mining quickly proved unprofitable and was discontinued. In 1850, in the census, there were only some 500 Chinese miners in California out of a total of 58,000. But as news of gold traveled back to Hong Kong, the Chinese began their own rush to California. In 1851, some 2,700 arrived in San Francisco, and by the end of 1852, there were 20,000 Chinese in the state. Unlike the first miners, these came on their own account, with funds furnished by relatives or on credit tickets arranged by immigration agents. The gold rush in Victoria opened in 1851, and in 1852, Chinese began traveling to the Victoria gold fields, both from California, possibly to escape violence there, and directly from Guangdong province. Between 1851 and 52, a few thousand Chinese made their way to Australia, and in 1855, another 11,000 arrived. So Chinese began to call Australia Xinjinshan, the new gold mountain, which is why we call San Francisco Zhoujinshan, the old gold mountain. Chinese miners migrating to Australia appear to have mostly gone on credit tickets, although some might have gone as indentures, although in Australia desertion is also a problem. Now, in both California and Victoria, alluvial gold mining was generally practiced by individuals working on their own or in partnerships of 2 or 3 men. That's across the board. The Chinese fit the same pattern. Partners often were close close relatives, perhaps brothers or cousins, often from the same village or from the same clan lineage. They often formalize their partnerships by registering their claims. In California, where there are a very small number of claims registers extant, but in Victoria there are many because the colonial government began these in the beginning. These show predominant of small partners of 2 to 3 million. Here you see this wonderful map of the Castlemaine, Victoria, of a section, and all these little squares are claims, and I don't know if we can read this here, but you can see Cheap by Jow, Malloy, O'Connor, Murphy, Lochung, Chung, Akut, Burns, Connolly, right? They're all working next to each other and fighting with each other too, probably at the same time. But their fighting wasn't necessarily just on race. California mine censuses show small companies with names like John China Placer Mining Company or Hong Kong China Wing Dam Company. These usually had 10 to 20 workers, and the census would list their equipment: sluice boxes and races, wing dams, water wheels. Here you have a small hydraulic mining company in Truman County. The principal investor was usually a local merchant, usually coming from the same district or clan lineage as the workers. This man would have bought or used the claim to furnish equipment. They operated not on wages but on shares, with the merchant investor taking a larger share, 60% perhaps, and the miners sharing the rest. Now, in addition to these merchant investor small companies, you see many cooperatives, and here's one on marital street. Cooperatives usually have fewer than 10 men, 4 in this photo, working smaller claims with low-tech equipment like lockers and sluice boxes. Now, they also operated on shares, but in this case, they were equal shares. They had no bosses. Usually had one person who served as a treasurer who held the gold and paid out earnings at the end of the week, and members shared tasks like cooking and collecting firewood. The register of mining claims in one in Calaveras County, California, from the 1850s showed 67 Chinese claims, and 82% were partnerships and small equal share cooperatives. In Australia, you see the same formations. In the late 60s, from 50 to 80% of the 7,000 Chinese working in the gold districts were enumerated as small companies and cooperatives. Chinese companies favored sluicing, which required moderate investment and drew from Chinese agricultural irrigation engineering techniques. The Bendigo Advertiser reported in December 1878 Chinese sluicing companies working at 3 shifts around the clock using 3 million gallons of water a week. Small companies also work together to achieve economies of scale. A common method was called paddocking, in which cooperatives and companies work together, working ability from end to end. Now, one of the most interesting things I found is that both the small companies and cooperatives, are similar to mining organizations found in China and Southeast Asia. In southern China, placer techniques were used to mine tin and iron sand deposits, not gold, but also drew from agricultural water irrigation practices. Mine operators sometimes hired local farmers during the slack season, but there were also small companies of full-time miners, often comprising landless men who worked for shares under a management investor. The cooperatives in California and Victoria bear a canny resemblance to the famous Chinese gongsi of West Borneo gold mines of the 18th and early 19th century. These were small egalitarian partnerships, as evidenced by their names like Shu Fan, 15 shares, or Xin Ba Fan, new 8 shares, with new kind of signaling a certain fluidity on the gold field. As mining developed, some of these cooperatives joined together into federations. As they grew larger, they also became less egalitarian. A few federations became extremely powerful and acted as though they were sovereign states. The power of the Borneo gongsi derived from the position of Chinese as a kind of in-between force between the Dutch and the native population, which conditions, of course, do not exist in the U.S. or Australia. Now, importantly, all of these formations, mining companies in southern China, egalitarian cooperatives in Borneo, and their counterparts in Australia and California,
They were all associated with sworn brotherhood societies. In southern China, these brotherhoods were fictive camp organizations of socially marginal men that had elaborate and secret ritual oaths, ceremonies, and exercises that cemented their solidarity. They could be both predatory and protective, engaged in mutual aid for their own members and thievery among the general population. During the Taiping Rebellion in the mid-19th century, many activists of the Tianping and Hongmen fled to Southeast Asia and beyond. In the 1850s, exiles formed a group throughout the diaspora called the Zhigong Tang. Cantonese, it's known in the U.S. as Qigong Tang, and in Australia it's called Yixing, but it's all the same organization. And these were extremely popular in the mining districts in both the U.S. and Victoria. And we also found it in South Africa. That's the story. These groups were nearly invisible to Euro-Americans. They only were noticed when so-called Tang Wars erupted between rival factions, but they were in fact a major form of social organization and cohesion. Okay, so Chinese, besides these cooperative forms, small companies, and working on their own, they also worked for wages for white employers as early as the 1850s and 60s. There's a very famous picture from Auburn Ravine in Placer County, 1852, that shows Chinese and white workers working together for a company with a network of sluices. This is not a very large company, but it's still a modest technology, but profitable at scale. Chinese worked underground in the southern mines of California from the 1850s to 70s. An observer remarked that they worked shoulder to shoulder with Cornish miners in John Freeman's mines in Mariposa. By 1870, Chinese underground miners were earning nearly the rate of whites. They also worked as unskilled laborers in the quartz mills, feeding the giant stamping machines that crushed the tons of rock dug up from the earth to release the gold when the veins were thinned. They also worked for water companies and hydraulic mining companies. Water companies delivered water from mountain lakes and reservoirs to the hydraulic mining companies, which use high-pressure hoses to blast away the sides of mountain ridges to get to the ancient riverbeds. By the 1860s, California water companies had erected 6,000 miles of flumes and ditches at a capital cost of $200 million, delivering billions of cubic yards of water a year to mining companies. Parenthetically, this was California's first industrial environmental disaster. Chinese worked on wages in both in construction and in the mining operations. This is the largest in the state, North Bloomfield Company in Nevada County, which employed 800 Chinese and 300 whites in its ditches. The most common practice was to hire Chinese through a headman as gang labor, but some companies also hired and paid Chinese individually. In Victoria, in the 1860s and 70s, Chinese also found employment with quartz mining companies. An 1868 census reported 700 Chinese working for whites on wages in one district. And although some Chinese worked underground, it was more common for them to work in the mills, feeding and running the stamping machines. Chinese also paid for the right to rewash tailings for gold, which was a low yield proposition, and others practiced tributing. Tailings is all the junk that's left over. Others practiced tributing, which was not wage labor but a contract with a company to treat and stack the tailings. Small companies and cooperatives likely made these contracts. According to one historian, tailings work was not scrabbling around on the rubble, but one stage in its complex and sophisticated process. Now, if it surprises us to find all this variety, right, this independent prospecting, share companies, egalitarian cooperatives, wage labor among Chinese miners, I think that surprise may index our resistance to seeing Chinese labor in a diverse and flexible manner, or to even see similarities with the economic organization of whites. Miners of all nationalities drew from their respective cultural backgrounds and learned from each other ways to devise work that suited the demands of alluvial mining. Working in small groups enabled miners to work more efficiently, to take turns at the more arduous tasks, and to share costs and rewards. Hence the observation by the Australian historian Geoffrey Searle that, quote, in his early years, the Victorian gold industry was almost exclusively worked by thousands of tiny cooperative groups. Now, I argue that Chinese cooperative practices endured because they were sustained by the solidarity of native place and brotherhood societies. These formations might even be considered a kind of refuge from capitalist arrangement and even a resistance to it. Europeans and Americans did not have analogous cultural resources to resist capital. They were also arguably more familiar with, if unenthusiastic about, wage labor. So when the placer deposits diminished, whites traded their autonomy for the relative security of a job, or they quit mining altogether. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about politics and policy. In the first few years of the California rush, whites viewed Chinese both with hostility and with benign curiosity. It was not until 1850 that Chinese miners became associated with indentured labor in the public discourse, even though they were no longer coming to the gold fields under contracts. In a special address to the state legislature in April of 1852, Governor John Bigler alleged that Chinese in the state were unfree. The speech was, at one level, it was vague, right? He says, quote, it is not officially known whether these persons are here in a state of voluntary or involuntary servitude. On the other hand, it's filled with kind of incendiary, wild claims, like, these coolies are paid at a rate of $3 a month, which is preposterous. Bigler, who was up for re-election that year, might be the first California politician to ride into office on the coolie question. Now, the press reported Bigler's speech throughout the gold mining districts, which gave whites license to attack and take the property of Chinese. White miners' assemblies throughout the state passed resolutions bidding the Chinese to leave. One of the first meetings held in Columbia in Colomay County, within a month of Bigler's speech, echoed the governor's charges of coolieism. By 1853, comparison of Chinese immigration to the Negro slave trade and the charge that Asiatic degraded the standard of American labor were staples of political discourse in California. Whites in California had found in the trope of coolieism a racial shorthand for associating Chinese with African slavery, the quickest way to place them beyond the pale of civilization. Now, Chinese were not actually indentured. The larger fiction that they were a coolie race overwhelmed any inconveniences of fact. In fact, the power of the coolie trope lay partly in its ambiguity, its ability to serve various agendas. As Moon Ho Jung has shown, the figure of the coolie became important in white Americans' thinking as they wrestled with the meanings of enslaved and free labor and sought solutions to labor scarcity in the post-bellum era. The coolie question quickly moved to the center of Chinese inclusion politics in the United States. Coolieism was imagined as a racial condition, that imagined Chinese as servile, without individual personality or will, regardless of their actual status. So thus, after the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery and indentured servitude, nativists easily relocated coolieism to the credit ticket system, which is what Barth speaks to us later, which they imagined as a system of totalizing control by Chinese merchant bosses. In fact, the use of credit to finance passage to America was not unique to Chinese, but common among immigrants in the 19th century, including Europeans. Immigration credit tickets and funded by immigration agents also were active in bringing Chinese to migrate to Victorian gold fields in the 1850s, both from the Siyi or Seiyang region of Guangdong, which is where whence the Chinese to California came, and also from Xiamen in Fujian province. Now, if coolieism was the central trope of exclusion politics in the United States, anti-Chinese racism in Australian colonies had a different inflection. I think we mostly assume that they repeat the same discourse, and they actually do come together several decades later. But during the gold rushes, I have found some important differences. European diggers in Australia claimed that Chinese were dirty and immoral, that they were linguistically and culturally too different to assimilate, and especially that they were innumerable, that they did not allege that they were slaves. If in the American case, the specter of racial slavery haunted the labor question and all variations of the race question, The legacy of unfreedom in the Australian colonies is not racialized slavery, but convict transportation of the English and Irish poor. The complaint that Chinese were vice-ridden and criminal might have been particularly evocative in this context. More important, I think, were the fears generated by Australians' location at the edge of the British Empire in the Pacific. Colonials were especially sensitive to the relatively sparse population, only 400,000 in 1850, and their isolation in the greater Asia Pacific. As one Melbourne newspaper explained, quote, geographically we are nearer the pent-up millions of China than any other large tract of country occupied by the white man. We are still but a handful of men and women and children. European colonists were obsessed with the idea that they could be swamped by a Chinese invasion, betraying a sense of their fragile hold on the continent and their vulnerability in a larger struggle between two empires in Asia, the British and the Chinese. Now, Victoria's predecessor, the Port Phillip district of New South Wales, did have a brief phase of importing indentured Asiatics, Chinese, Indians, and Malays for shepherding work in the 1840s, when convict transportation ended, and with it the practice of assigning unpaid penal labor to pastoralists. But that practice was abandoned at the end of the decade because settlers wanted a free colony, one without convicts, former convicts, or indentured Asians. And Victoria was founded as such in 1851. Victorians understood indenture and were not prone to use that term promiscuously. They opposed Chinese immigration precisely because it was voluntary and hence in their mind uncontrollable and unstoppable. White racism in Australia expressed the settler colonial outlook, which considered colored labor acceptable in the tropics but not in the temperate zones of European settlement. British settler colonials in Canada and Africa, as well as Australia, held to their racial prerogatives dearly. Their perceived interests clashed with the British policy of free trade and free movement of British subjects within the empire. Indian immigration to Canada and Africa, and Chinese immigration to Australia from Singapore and Hong Kong, and also from China by treaty right, provoked whites-only movements in all of these settler colonies. On notable occasions, Europeans held agitated monster meetings on the gold fields and resorted to mob violence against the Chinese, and notably, many of these involved Americans who had come to California. The largest race riot in the Buckland River Valley in Victoria in 1857 and at Lambling Flat in New South Wales in 1861 involved hundreds of marauding and often drunken whites who destroyed Chinese property and forced them to flee the Gold Coast. Now, these differences in the framings of anti-Chinese racism, the American version framed by comparisons to slavery, and the Australian version by prerogatives of empire, also had policy implications. California entered the Union as a free state in 1850, but like other Western territories, it considered free labor to be free white labor. Its earliest laws restricting the rights of free blacks applied to Chinese as well, such as Indian miscegenation laws and barring testimony by non-whites, the important these rights. But the state also had a weak presence in the frontier environment of the gold mining districts. Equally important, the gold fields were in the public domain. Technically, miners were trespassing on federal lands. Congress did not pass legislation regulating property rights in mining until 1866. In the meantime, miners held their own assemblies and passed their own rules, as I've mentioned before. These rules defined the size of a claim, the terms of possession, when somebody else could take an abandoned claim, and how disputes would be adjudicated, and also whether Chinese would be allowed. Most mining districts forbade Chinese to own claims, and some forbade claim holders from hiring Chinese. The Foreign Miners Tax of 1852 aimed specifically at the Chinese and wigged business interests favorable to the China trade, and the use of Chinese labor increasingly lost political ground in state politics. By the time of the Civil War, California had built a legal and customary edifice of anti-Chinese policy. In Victoria, anti-Chinese agitation among European miners clashed with official colonial policy of equal protection. This principle, enshrined in precepts of Enlightenment liberalism, was a conceit belied by Britain's vast empire acquiring violence, dispossession, unequal treaties, and the like. But the colonial government did oppose individual and group violence against Chinese. In 1854, a Troops dispatched by the colonial governor thwarted an anti-Chinese riot plotted at Ballarat. After the riots, the government of the colony paid Chinese shopkeepers £7,300 in compensation for goods destroyed by arson and looting. Police were far more likely to arrest and prosecute Europeans who committed crimes against Chinese in Victoria than they were in California. But in general, Victoria pursued policies of restriction and segregation. Voiced in the paternalist language of protection, these policies in fact conceded to and protected European interests. Victoria attempted to restrict Chinese immigration in 1855 by imposing landing fees and tonnage restrictions on incoming ships carrying Chinese passengers. 2 years later, it established a Chinese protectorate, segregated residential camps for Chinese in the goldfield districts, which aimed to reduce conflict by separating the races. These drew both from Aboriginal policy and the British policy of indirect governance in the Straits settlements and other Asian colonies. The villages were inconvenient and disruptive to Chinese work and social organization, and barely half of the Chinese population lived in them. Chinese also lobbied extensively against the special taxes levied upon them, and many simply refused to pay. The protectorate proved unenforceable and was abolished in 1863, although some of the villages transformed and rebuilt as Chinese. Now, in both California and Victoria, Euro-American miners drove Chinese from employment in the quartz mines in the early 1870s. In California, the mining companies introduced new technologies that achieved greater productivity and hence threatened the number of jobs. And in Victoria, after a period of economic downturn and unemployment, the Amalgamated Miners Association formed in 1874, and in the founding meeting, they passed a resolution forbidding its members to work on any claim to hire Chinese. Now, with their options becoming more constrained in both California and Victoria, Chinese moved into many other trades, market gardening, peddling, laundries. But the Chinese in Australia were not as marginalized as were their counterparts in California. They continued to mine, to buy and sell claims, sometimes in partnerships with whites, which is unheard of in California, and a few even invested in stocks in the mining exchange and in quartz companies in Victoria, Queensland, and Northern Territory. Chinese in California did not have access to investment in large-scale operations or in white-owned companies. Those who were successful at gold mining usually reinvested their profits in mercantile pursuits, agriculture, or other businesses in Chinatown. So this, the widespread belief that Chinese in California were unfree began in the 1850s and carries through pretty much without break into the urban working men's movement in the 1870s and 80s. Anti-cooleyism remained foundational to California politics as state party politics drove the Chinese question to national exclusion legislation in 1882. The coolie trope does not appear in Australia until the late 70s and 80s, and its entrance comes by two routes. The first was growing controversy over the use of Asian and Pacific Islander contract labor in northern Queensland and the Northern Territory in mining, plantation agriculture, and maritime pearling. White Australians had conceded the use of colored labor in the far north, but the problem in Australia was that the tropical areas were not separate islands like Jamaica or Mauritius, but contiguous to the temperate zones. By the 1880s, whites in Australia became increasingly alarmed at the growth and mobility of the Chinese population in the far north. South Australia, which administered the Northern Territory, in 1881 imposed a Chinese head tax at a line, an imaginary line 200 miles south of Port Darwin. The second wellspring of anti-cooleyism was in the cities, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, and this is a very famous cartoon from the Bulletin, a newspaper city. The movement of Chinese to the cities in the 60s and 70s provoked alarm among whites, even though the urban Chinese population was small and concentrated in a few niche trades such as market gardening, hawking, and furniture making. But trade unionists and politicians wooing working class voters dominated the urban anti-Chinese leagues in the 1880s. Monster meetings were held in big cities. In one example, 3,000 people gathered in Melbourne in 1880 to urge the legislature to deal suppressively with Chinese immigration for the sake of European workers' jobs. Notably, the urban anti-Chinese movement borrowed directly from California's anti include rhetoric, creating a more comprehensive and powerful racialist and masculinist ideology that served well emerging Australian nationalism. The Brisbane Courier intoned, and I think this captures much of the politics. Quote, "We aim at making Queensland from south to north a British colony and someday to be a portion of an Anglo-Australian nation. We want no servile race amongst us with which ours will not amalgamate, and which must bring to us, as to every nation that has encouraged such a solution for its labor difficulties, a terrible curse." During the 1880s, several intercolonial conferences discussed the need for uniform restrictions on Chinese immigration. Many already had tonnage requirements and landing fees. Some also restricted Chinese from the franchise. Australian colonials wanted something like the American Chinese Exclusion Act. But British imperial policy prohibited categorical exclusion. The Chinese question was really two questions: one, a colonial question over migration, and the other, an imperial question over commerce and diplomacy. And these questions grew increasingly at odds with one another and strained both Anglo-Australian relations and Sino-British relations. It would not be until Federation in 1901 that white Australia came fully into its own, with the rapid succession of the passage of the Immigration Restriction Act, the Pacific Islander Labor Act, which was a mass deportation to cleanse the far north of colored labor, and the Franchise Act, which barred Aboriginal school building. But if my point here has been that Chinese labor, Chinese miners were not, as alleged, enslaved or otherwise unfree, I also wanted to say that I think we should neither simply recast the Chinese as free labor. At a certain level, of course, this is true. They were not held as chattels. They possessed ability. But like all workers, their experience included aspects of both volition and coercion. The corporatist forms observable among Chinese miners, share partnerships and cooperatives, mutual aid associations, sworn brotherhood societies, I think these are also not comprehensible in terms of Orientalist binary, backward versus modern, despotic versus progressive. They are better understood as early modern economic and social forms that the miners brought with them from southern China and adapted to local conditions. Their adaptations were both responses to discriminations and exclusions imposed by whites and strategies of ethnic persistence and survival. From both these dynamics, Chinese miners and their communities developed both as a part of and apart from capitalist mining development in mainstream rural American society. And if the organization of Chinese miner was similar in California and Victoria, as well as similar to some Euro-American economic practices, the different inflections in American and Australian racisms tells us then less about the actual condition of Chinese miners than they do about the contingent and historical context informing racial politics. British and American goldfields societies proved capacious enough to accommodate diverse European groups, but not the Chinese, nor in the California case Mexicans and South Americans. European colonialism and Orientalist thinking had already classified the Chinese as too difficult to assimilate. But actual contact on the ground had the potential, always has the potential, to erode the force of stereotype. Racial ideas on the goldfields had to resonate with local conditions in order to be compelling to mobilize for political action. Later in the 19th and early 20th century, the local iterations of anti-Chinese racism blended into a common discourse of anti-colonialism, part of a global trend among self-described white men's countries. If at its heart, Anglo-American settler colonialism was about native dispossession and building white men's countries, Chinese immigrants disrupted and unsettled that vision. By the early 20th century, Chinese exclusion was the rule throughout the Anglo-American settler colonial world. But a half century of voluntary migration and settlement originating in the gold rushes had already proved impossible. I like impossible. Proved impossible the idea that whites could ever completely contain China and control the Pacific world. Thank you.
We have ample time for questions and comments, so please fire away. And don't hesitate to grab some more food in the back.
I'm a history teacher. I was 3 years in China, and I just returned. And I met some guys in Beijing who help Chinese immigrate to the United States today for a fee and arrange their investments and so on. And they said that Australia and Canada have really tightened up a lot in the last few years. Have you heard this? Do you have any comment about immigration today?
Well, it's been much easier for people from China to immigrate to Canada and Australia, especially if you have money, you have capital. I don't know about recent developments of those.
The comment was that they got a sense of saturation in Canada and Australia. They're smaller countries, and it's difficult for them to absorb these large numbers. USA has more capacity to take on these.
But it's even harder to get into the USA. Right? I'm sorry, I don't know current Canadian and Australian policy. I mean, there are a lot of Chinese in Toronto and Vancouver and in Sydney especially. Australia is kind of the second, a very favored destination for Chinese middle class and upper class. It's closer to China. It's a temperate climate. So for all the reasons that Chinese like to go there in the 19th century, they still like to go there in the 20th. And Australia has, Australia now has, wants to have a different sensibility about itself, right? It wants to commit to being a nation of the Asia Pacific. So it's trying to be less hostile to Asians, more friendly to Asians. And it apologized to the Aborigines 10 years ago, which is another interesting story because that's all they did was they said they were sorry. They didn't do anything else. So they're still very poor and disadvantaged. So Australia, I think, is an interesting place right now in terms of racial politics because it's really tried to embrace a multiculturalism, and yet it still wants to preserve the prerogatives of white power. So that might be where this tension with recent Chinese migration is coming from.
You talk reminds me of some recent research on the padrone system. That same contract labor system that brought Italians over and ostensibly kept them under the extortive thumb of the labor bosses. And a lot of the recent research is that it's probably more fiction than fact.
Which part is fiction?
The padrone, that there was a padrone system, and a good fiction to be used by those who want just to close the doors to all immigration and sensationalize that in eastern cities. In fact, I find it interesting that I believe in Congress in the early 1880s, the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Act prohibiting labor contracting were sort of tandem bills that were floating through Congress.
Yeah, the Foreign Act was 1885.
Yeah, so it was always those things, exclusionism and attacking the labor contractors was very, very similar, used by those who want to close the doors, period.
Yeah.
So, but I have a question for you about how all this would apply to the use of Chinese labor and railroads and railroad construction. That you have initially in Goldbarney a fairly sort of crazy patchwork quilt of enterprises without great capital intensity. It doesn't surprise me that there would be claims, and even claims supported by merchants. When you get to more capital-intensive production systems, like the major construction projects, I still believe you're going to find labor contracting at work here, and that the recruitment not being of a real individualist base. So I'm curious whether what you find in mind would really.
Well, okay, so labor contracting is not the same as indentured labor.
Yeah, I understand that.
And the charge against Chinese was that they were indentured, or that they were later that they were just controlled by debt peonage, right? So so you're right. In capital-intensive projects, ethnic gang contracting, ethnic gang labor is common. Right? that's how these big flumes get built, right, in California in the 1860s and 70s. And it's the kind of labor used on the railroads. And this is where the padrone system actually, I think, was not a fiction in Western North America. This is Gunther Barth's book, talks a lot about padrone labor, ethnic contracting in Western Canada and in the Western United States. So ethnic gang labor is a very common form used in the 19th century, and it dates back to the Irish canal workers, right, in the early 19th century, who built all the canals in the Northeast. And so the question is why that form of labor becomes racialized, right, and why it becomes presumed that the workers have no freedom, right? And I think, and Peck makes this argument too. I mean, I think contract workers in these kinds of projects are, you know, they have a kind of, I mean, the fiction is in free labor, okay? I mean, the free labor wants to keep pushing people on the other side of this line of free labor so they can keep what they consider free labor to be truly free, right? But, you know, I mean, there are those who say that all wage labor is wage slavery, right? So this is a kind of political move that's made in a time when free labor is actually quite precarious, right? And people are nervous about what their own freedom means. And the easiest way to make free labor look better is by saying that the easiest way to make the distinction is to make a racial distinction, because there actually is not a whole, you know, the distinctions are occupied continuum, right? So a lot of ethnic gang labor, especially in isolated regions, is very impressive because it's hard to quit because you can't get to another job, right? But even there, the control of the bosses over contract workers was never absolute, right? And people went on strike, they desert, they strike for better wages. So I think the question is, why do certain groups become why does it become a racial trait, right? And I think in a certain sense, it's because after the Civil War, when the freedom, the free character of free labor was actually quite tenuous, and one way you make it more free is by saying, you know, all these other people are unfree. You know, I mean, a lot of people criticize the Irish canal workers for being drunks, you know, for being, you know, all kinds of things, but they never said they were slaves, right? Because obviously in the 1820s they weren't slaves, right? But in 1870 it's actually, you know, fuzzier what it means to be enslaved or free. Interestingly, after slavery is abolished. So I think you're right that this is an issue. To me, the question is not whether or not they work under contract, but why free labor decides that these are not free workers, that they are somehow, due to their racial characteristics, right, considered bound. Now, the Italian, who are racialized in many ways, like the Chinese, right, that the kind of propensity to contract labor is some kind of racial weakness, they overcome that, right? The Chinese are not able to overcome this racialization, and I think that's in part because, you know, Italians become more urban, they go into more waged work, you know, they're white, you know, they're able to overcome this taint that they're an unfree race, right? Whereas Chinese are not really able to overcome that.
Thanks for the presentation. I was wondering to what extent China itself is going to figure in the research, in the circuits that you're describing. I was really curious about your depiction of Chinese migrants as bringing an early modern form of labor organization and business organization elsewhere. And I wondered whether part of the story too is about changes that would take place in China, partly through all of this circulation, whether in those forms of economic organization or in forms of racial ideology that might be formed through these experiences as well.
Well, I'm not doing the same kind of research on China, because I'm mostly looking at the diasporic communities. But some of the organizations that are, like the native place organizations that are highly misunderstood by Americans, by contemporaries, right? They're seen as all controlling, or they're actually seen as labor agencies, which they're not. They're mutual aid associations. These organizations actually have, those are adaptations of a form in China. So the origins of these practices is important to me, but I'm mostly looking at the diaspora.
Could you talk a little bit about some of the factors instigating the diaspora, and to what extent those are, artifacts of the political and economic conditions in
Sure.
China on the one hand, and perhaps the economic conditions
Sure.
in the late 19th century in the U.S.?
Right, sure. Well, I mean, in southern China, in the middle part of the 19th century, there's tremendous upheaval, both from an ongoing political conflict, rapid population increase, cycles of drought and flooding. It's kind of a mess, right? So there's already a lot of internal migration in southern China that goes back another 75 years, and kind of proto-capitalist production in cities. So there's already a fair amount of movement, and it's the opening of the treaty ports, right, that enables Chinese to leave, both as indentures, especially to former plantation colonies. I mean, there is a big so-called coolie trade of Chinese going to Cuba, Peru, and also Southeast Asia to work on contracts. So there is an indenture, traffic in indentures, and some of it is horrific. And then there's, but also the credit ticket system, which enables Chinese who are of slightly better means, not wealthy by any case, but they're not the ones who are kidnapped into the coolie trade, right? For them, the favored destinations are California, also Hawaii, and Australia. Right? These are the favored destinations. And with the gold rushes, right, there's a whole international traffic going on that China becomes part of. And it's actually faster to get from China to California by ship than it is to get from Boston to California. Right? That's a much longer journey before the transcontinental railroad is built. You either have to go overland or on a wagon, or you have to go through Panama. Go by ship to Panama, get off the ship, get across this, and then get on another ship, right? So, or go around the Cape. So they're trying. I mean, the biggest migration of Chinese is to Southeast Asia. It's not really either to the plantation colonies or to Australia or the United States. It's the largest out migration has been going on for quite a while in Southeast Asia. And there you have a whole range of arrangements, from credit tickets, indenture, and voluntary migration. And there's a whole other picture. Yes.
Going back to where you began, just with the historiographic question, is there any way to tease out from 1964 whether it's just a lack of critical review that has led to a nearly 50-year misrepresentation, or is there a latent racial prejudice behind that allows you to get away with lack of critical review in the simplest
Well, that's just my
evidence?
conclusion, that it's a latent prejudice where, people are willing to just repeat. I mean, it was a very important book, and everybody repeats it. And I actually started on this, to be truthful, when I had a student writing a senior thesis, and I was a second reader, and he wrote about the California Workingmen's Party, and he repeated all this stuff, and I said, no, that's bad. Those are bad sources. And he says, well, show me. And I couldn't. Because I knew they were bad, but, I had not really looked into it. It took me 2 years to actually reconstruct all the footnotes and all this trail of questionable scholarship. It's actually not obvious if you read the literature. And everybody quotes the same editorials from that Daily Alta, right? Well, if you read the newspapers, I mean, we know reading newspapers that you can't read it as a transparent. I mean, the newspapers have a lot of stuff in them, right? They're editorials that say the Chinese are servile and controlled by the bosses, and then there are lots of other things in newspapers that describe these cooperatives, right? But if you just read the editorials, you know, you get a certain, you know what the political view is, but you don't know what the fact on the ground is. So, anyway, so my conclusion was that you can only explain this repetition of the same bad sources if, well, one, you had to think that people hadn't actually read the primary sources, they hadn't read them carefully, and then you have to ask why. Why would otherwise very careful historians be so sloppy? Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question about the dynamics of sort of anti-Chinese agitation or mobilization. So in the context of California, I know the foundation of the Working Party was very much led by the Irish.
Mm-hmm.
This was potentially an avenue for them demonstrating or achieving their whiteness.
Right.
And I'm curious if you found a similar dynamic at play in South Africa, Australia, Canada.
In Australia, it's not so much about proving whiteness as it is about preserving whiteness of the colonies. So it is about their white identity. The Irish in Australia are a very large population, partly descended from convict transportation, but also there was a lot of assisted Irish immigration to Australia after convict transportation. And so I think the Irish kind of become white in Australia very early, because it's like going to the West, right? It's where you can become white. But they don't need really the Chinese to become white. I think they become white against Aboriginals, and with this kind of vision of Australia being a place of settlement for the British. And I think later when the anti-Chinese politics in Australia gets really virulent, it's really about the class question becomes really the vehicle for what I think is kind of a white nationalism, an Australian nationalism. Right? It's where they say they have to separate from the British, but where their interests are diametrically opposed to that of the imperial policy. And so there's a lot of, in the 1880s, there's a lot of friction and even crisis when Australians basically start passing laws against the Chinese, that the Foreign Office in London just goes crazy because they say you can't do that, and yet they do it. So in the end, the Privy Council in 1891 or 2 basically concedes that the colonies, the so-called self-governing colonies, can restrict immigration. But even that for Australians is not enough, so they go all the way to the Federation. Yes?
There was a program some time ago, a PBS program on position of the Chinese in California. And one point that they made I thought was interesting, I would comment on it, that the Chinese men who came to the United States did not always bring their wives with them.
They usually didn't.
So that this incidence of so many men without their wives there was a contributing factor to some of the problems, social problems that may have existed. And I wonder if you found a change over time in the sort of marital status of the Chinese men who had come to these areas.
Well, I guess what I want to say is that that's a common late migration pattern in the 19th century and the early 20th century of men who leave their families behind and send remittances home. Europe in the first decade of the 20th century, the return rates among European groups was Oh, you're seeing all my pictures now. He's very cute. That's oversharing. The return rates for Southern European groups was 50% and higher. Right? For some groups, like for Greeks, it was 70, 80%. So it's a common migration strategy for labor, right? Where men go abroad and send money home, and they immigrate with the intention of going back. So circular migration is not only a one-time return, but often, there are Italians who would circulate by years, like they would go abroad for a couple of years and then go back to Italy and come back. So it's a common pattern, but with the Chinese, it was interpreted as a kind of racial and social evil to have so many single men, and then it became a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, because then with the exclusion laws, the first exclusion laws excluded women, right, on grounds that they were prostitutes. So it's very, very hard for Chinese women to come. Basically, unless you were the wife of a merchant and had bound feet, they considered you, they assumed you were a prostitute. So, so the lack of Chinese women in California is due both to Chinese custom, right, where the wife doesn't leave the family's home, a common labor migration practice, and American law, right, which actually says even if you wanted to bring your wife, we won't let you. So, so I think that the dangers associated with sex ratio imbalance is more manufactured than it is real, because it was actually common. It does create problems. It creates problems. Also, when they say you can't marry anybody else, you can't marry a white person. There are Chinese men who married black women, Mexican women, because they weren't allowed to marry white women. And there were Chinese men who had married a woman, a non-white woman in the United States, and also had a wife in China. That was not uncommon. That's actually not uncommon among other groups, too, to have a second family in the United States. But I think with the Chinese, it becomes racialized, and it's also then perpetuated by exclusion laws.
I have a couple of questions. This is also interesting. One is, what do you know about the actual trajectory of the experience of these gold miners in the United States? Were they circular migrants? What happened to them over time? Did they make some money? Was it worked out for them? And the other is just what was the subsequent history of gold mining after the 1882 Exclusion Act?
Well, I think the experience varies. There's some who get enough gold and go home. In Australia, there are many more. It seems. I don't have data, but there are some data. I take that back. Upwards of half the Chinese who came in the 19th century went back. Now that's not only miners. That's all Chinese. But I think people do go back. There are a lot of anecdotal evidence about Chinese with a lot of gold who go back. And one of the accusations about the Chinese was that they took the gold out of the country. But everybody did that. Some remain in mining for decades, kind of scratching out a very meager livelihood. Some moved to the cities. Some who work on the railroads or moved to the cities. A lot of them moved to San Francisco or to Sacramento. They moved to the cities. So I think mining. There is one stereotype that the Chinese were willing to work claims abandoned by whites, and to kind of the stereotype is like through patience, they could eke out a little bit of gold, just a little bit. Actually, I think Chinese had certain technological knowledge that whites didn't have, like with water irrigation, how to use water, and able to, they were forbidden to buy claims, but they were allowed to buy abandoned claims, right? Because the whites abandoned them and wanted to sell them to somebody. So, so they were able to make a living, some of them. So I think how much they made, I mean, like all gold miners, most of them didn't make very much. But like some gold miners, some of them made some money. But it's interesting because they remain in California and in Australia, they remain a presence even at the margins of these kind of dying gold towns, these ghost towns. They're still there. Or there are traces of them still there.
Yeah, I have maybe a different version of Michael's question, which is, I was fascinated by your on-the-ground description of the variety of labor arrangements and mining arrangements, which opens up really interesting ways of thinking about this whole process of labor in the 19th century. But I'm wondering what happens. Does the cooperative form, for example, persist in in Chinese urban settlements or in other places in agriculture after the waning of the gold rush period? Do these other forms of collective ownership or shareholding persist? These strike me as novel and quite interesting in thinking about the way, economic organization in that period. And then one kind of tangential but somewhat related point, you mentioned but didn't really flesh out the differences between the relations between white stakeholders and Asians or Chinese in Australia versus in the United States, suggesting that there were possibilities for partnerships in Australia that were very unusual or almost impossible in the United States. And I wanted to know a little bit more about why that Australia takes a different path on that.
So on the first point, we don't really see the cooperative form outside of mining, at least I haven't seen it. I think that's because the other areas where Chinese were engaged were either more capital intensive, like railroad construction, or agriculture in California very early is large scale industrial kind of agriculture. There might have been Chinese there were definitely Chinese hired in as work gangs, reclaiming the deltas. But most of the agricultural work, I think, either uses gang labor or, mostly uses gang labor. And in the cities, I don't see any evidence of cooperative forms. You see cooperative forms in terms of mercantile establishments where, there'll be like 20 partners. And that's in part to get around the exclusion laws because you become an independent merchant. So it's really easy to purchase a share in a mercantile business. But it does persist in mining. I worked on a piece that's going to come out next year. Book from Princeton on cultures in motion, and I did a piece on using the transcripts from a murder trial of a Chinese gold miner in Sierra County. And this is in the late 1880s, and I saw evidence of a mining cooperative. Right? And they can't be making much money, but it's like 7 men sharing tasks, no boss, one treasurer. So they seem to persist at the margins of anybody who's still mining, because it's probably hard to even make any kind of living at that point. On your second point, that's a really important question, like the difference, why the difference. I think in Australia, because it could not pass categorical exclusion, and many Chinese were British subjects. I mean, a lot of Chinese who came to Australia actually came from Singapore. So they're British subjects, and they had what they call imperial citizenship. Or imperial subjecthood, not citizenship, they're imperial subjecthood. So they had free movement, and because colonial policy actually was more tolerant, it was not as exclusionary as in California. They're not as oppressed. And they have this idea to segregate them in these protectorates, these camps, and the Chinese won't go. And they can't, the only way they can make them live there would be at gunpoint, and they won't go that far. the Chinese seem to settle into, they command whole sections of mining districts that you don't really see in California. In California, they seem much more scattered, and I think that's because they're driven out of a lot of places. But in Australia, you see you see things like this, which is just amazing, right? This is, these are all like Chinese groups, and they're working this long gully. And in some places they're side by side with whites, and in other, like we saw on that map, and in other places they cover whole, vast areas. I've only found one such place in California, outside of Oroville, where there was a lot of Chinese-owned claims, and it just took up a huge area for about 5 or 6 years.
We have time maybe for one more question.
Were the Chinese confined to particular occupation when they became the first group? And if so, to what extent was this a product of the mining industry reorganization?
Well, when mining becomes more capitalized, right, which is when they start mining underground rock. As I said, there is evidence that Chinese work underground as miners right next to whites for a good 15 years until they get driven out. And they get driven out around 1870 when they also work above ground for lower rates of pay, right, in the stamping mills where the rocks are crushed. And there are lots of little jobs like miner's helper and things like this. So, but they do work underground, and they're driven out of the mines in 1870 when the mine owners introduce the single-handed drill, right? Before a double-handed drill needed 2 men to drill, and then when you have a single-handed drill, you can get rid of 1 person, right? And they introduced a new explosive into the mines that had been, it's kind of like dynamite, but it wasn't. But they introduced an explosive that also whites thought would threaten their jobs. So there's a very long strike of white miners, the miners in California. And their demands are to eliminate the one-handed drill, to eliminate the use of these explosives. They also want to have workers above and below ground that have the same rate of pay, which sounds nice, but nobody's going to do that, right? To give vastly more skilled workers the same rate as unskilled workers. And they demanded that the Chinese be discharged. So there's a very long strike, and they lose on every single count except for the last, right? That's the only thing they get. So they really don't get anything in terms of, productivity or things like that. All those things like the hydraulic companies, most of that, like this kind of work has been done by hydraulic mining is outlawed in California in the 1880s. So after that, the Chinese who work in gang labor or witches, that's all wage work. They kind of go out of business. So they do work for wages, and often they work consistently at less the rate of whites. Chinese labor is about $1.50 a day, and white labor is $2 to $3 a day. Chinese is $1.50 to $2, so it's half to 2/3 the white rates, and they do usually unskilled work and are supervised by whites.
Well, thank you very much, Mae. Once again, I invite you to go to the Social Science and Policy Forum webpage. You can get on our mailing list if you're not already on it. You can also find us on Facebook and get updated on our various events over the course of the year. So thank you very much.